Welcome to La Mama Galleria in New York. My name is Monika Fabijanska. I am the curator of the exhibition BETSY DAMON, Passages, Rites and Rituals. And it's my pleasure to take you on a short walkthrough through it. I first met Damon a year ago when I was doing research for my exhibition Ecofeminisms, a group exhibition. I found information about her works and I followed. The work that we presented in the show was a paper pulp installation. Essentially, you could call it a death mask of a dried riverbed. Dried because it was dammed, the river was dammed. It was just a fragment of an installation which in its entirety is 250 feet long. It was presented in the 1980s as MoMA PS1, then it traveled across the country and was presented in some other museums. I knew, doing this research, I realized that Damon did very important projects in China in mid-1990s. This work, the installation that I showed, Memory of Clean Water, was a pivot for her, which turned all of her attention, all of her future art practice into social practice, into activism devoted to the idea of living water and water conservation on the planet. So in mid-1990s she went to China. Not knowing Chinese, she organized a series of events, first in Chengdu, China, and then in Lhasa, Tibet, 1995, 1996, which is only a few years after Tiananmen Square. So obviously in China, public gatherings are not allowed. And there we have this American woman coming there from out of the blue, not knowing the language, not knowing people, organizing a series of outdoor performances and installations, which are terrific to say the least, and which documentation is very well known, with local artists, several of them, with the support of the city. She got the permit, she got the coverage of Chinese television, of media. It became a big thing. Not only it became a big thing for Chengdu, which led to her building a huge living water garden where she used botanical methods to clean the river water, but also became important for the development of art in China, in that part of China, which marked it with specific traits in performance made outdoors, and also ecological art. Keepers of the Waters, how these events were called, are being still continued as far as I know. So I asked myself a question: how come this was even possible? What kind of vocabulary this woman developed before that enabled her to organize something so impactful on such a scale, and also organize it with a whole group of other artists? And this exhibition is supposed to be the answer to this question. It presents her early performance, realized in New York City mostly, and taken on the streets of other American cities between 1976 and 86. These works come from these photographs come from a private performative session in the artist studio, which was only a block from here on 24 Bond Street. So La Mama Galleria is a perfect place to bring BETSY DAMON's early work home. And they've never been presented publicly. The objects in them were, but not the photographs, not this performative session, as I call it. It is important because it allows us to understand the roots of her work. A few years earlier, in 1972, Damon was in Ithaca, New York, where her husband taught at Cornell University. She used his position, or her position as a wife of a professor, because using her position as a professional artist was not an option. She already had 2 children, and a woman with 2 children was not considered a professional artist at that time. So she used his position and got money from the dean to organize feminist art studio. In that studio, they worked with other women, creating not even performances yet, rituals, some performances, very often in nature. Ithaca, of course, is beautifully set among woods and waterfalls, so a lot of these actions took place in nature. And Damon used natural materials, both in those performances and in her work, which slowly moved from geometrical painting to sculpture. She was sculpting from wood, chipping wood. So you see materials such as feathers and tree bark in those early works. This is 1976. She comes to New York, leaves the husband behind, and joins the lesbian art community. This is 1977, BETSY Damon's first public and really breakthrough performance that established her in the local artist community in New York. It's titled 7,000-Year-Old Woman. Damon imagined or dreamed this woman. The figure, the visual representation of woman covered with little bags or whatever that was, came to her in dream, and she later worked with this idea of an archetype of a woman, basically trying to ask who a woman is, who am I, beyond the traditional gender roles that are expected of me. It's very typical for BETSY Damon's work that she's trying to go back to who we are in our deepest essence, beyond how society limited us or formed us or organized us. And very important notes here. I find it crucial to understand that the artist formed her thoughts at the time when she was making these works, not a posteriori. She was aware what her intention was, and two intentions felt here are so important that I'm going to read a little bit of archival text. She wrote, "At some time in history, women were so connected to their strength that the separate concepts of mother, wife, lesbian, and the witch did not exist." I mentioned just before that it was impossible to be considered a professional artist with children. It was also not so easy to be a feminist with children and forget to be a lesbian with children. So she constantly, in that early moment of her career, navigated all those labels which seemed exclusionary, and that scar is left in her activism until today. Betsy's imagination is, or mission is to make us imagine everybody being there in their fullest, everything they are without labeling. And the next very important aspect of this performance is so complete has been the eradication of things female from our streets that we do not miss them. So the blind beggar woman very quickly walked out to the streets of New York, and that's what made her performances so incredible. This is the first iteration at Cayman Gallery, West Broadway, but if we move further down, you will see the 7,000-year-old woman in the streets. 7,000-year-old woman on Prince Street, near Broadway. A few months later, on May 21st, Betsy took part in something called the Artist Day. And this is one of very few of her outdoor performances which had any kind of institutional umbrella. It was, of course, not a museum, not a big organization, but it was a day when several artists, well, Betsy said several tens of artists, performed in Lower Manhattan outdoors. The point was, she was the only woman. I think it's important to remember that she was not very young at this point. She was around, in her late 30s, around 37 or 39. And I think this is remarkable to remember that with very strong expectations of female body, not only she does not conform to them through her costume, but also her age. The performance, the images are absolutely amazing. We very rarely see this kind of audience in performance art. Most performances, of course, are made to art world audience in galleries. Here we have the New York City crowd at its best. I didn't say that at the beginning. I decided not to use my voice in the exhibition, except for this walkthrough. It was only an introductory text, but every text here on the walls comes from the artist archive. There are incredible descriptions of these performances. Very often descriptions written by a few different persons who participated in them, and they were written at the time, on the day or maybe week of the performance. So together with images, they really give a very powerful understanding of what the intention, what the feeling, and what the actual performance was, especially that they are contradicting for each of participants. Betsy Damon herself, Sue Friedrich, who was taking photographs, which are quite spectacular, and Amy Sylvan, who is seen here, painting this little triangles as a circle protecting Damon from the crowd and also delineating the space of ritual. Each of their accounts of this performance is very different. Sue Friedrich writes really beautiful about how the boys were aggressive towards the performer. They were throwing eggs at Betsy, they were stealing the bags with flour and using them for street fight a block away. So it was a very lively scene with a lot of interaction with the locals. Women were so much more focused on her. How the performance developed, Damon would walk out along the spiral that was drawn on the floor, on the pavement, ripping with the knife through those bags filled with flour. Flour was also colored, dyed in from yellowish to purple hues, and then she would cut them off entirely off her body, referencing oppression of many sorts that defined her situation, the situation of a woman in society. And the next iteration of this performance takes place on Wall Street. Not only the boys are grown up and their intense stare at Damon is really giving us chills, but also what an incredible action to organize this women's witch circle, ritual circle, just in front of the Federal Hall steps and the statue of George Washington. It's remarkable that in each of these performances, other artists from the community participated. The person sitting on the far right in this circle here is Harmony Hammond. As soon as you start digging in women's history, you come to the memories of rape, either on a personal or on a social level. And in the natural development of this performance of looking into the history of woman, of who woman is and what her life or social presence and social limitations are, Betsy Damon digged to rape memories. It's interesting that she performed this version of 7,000-year-old woman for the first time at the Apple in Amsterdam. Very important exhibition, the first international feminist exhibition in Europe, with an incredible lineup of artists, a lot of Americans, many Americans, Linda Benglis, Mary Beth Edison, Suzanne Lacey, Lucy Picard took part in a panel, then Martha Wilson as well did her performance. Among Europeans, you have well-known Austrian artist Vali Export, Renata Bergman, Polish artist Natalia Elel, and so on and so on. It is a very important exhibition. And there, Damon develops 7,000-year-old woman to become the rape memory. The performance at the Apple is still without text. 7,000-year-old woman does what she did before in the streets, except for she's naked, completely vulnerable. And there is a participating artist who is unwinding a bundle of ropes instead of drawing a chalk line. And also, it's quite remarkable how big a crowd was there at the Apple. The artist's preferred mode of working is workshop. So she requested the Apple to organize a meeting for her with local women's gallery. And with this women, she workshopped the idea of rape memories. And together with her performance, they gave the rhythm, singing, chanting, moaning, shrieking, crying, and just breathing through it. So there's no text, but there is a lot of women's common joint presence in it. A couple of months later, she performed the same performance at Medusa's Revenge, a theater alternative space in New York City, and it becomes very different. Text comes in. This is the closest that Damon's performance comes to theater. It could just as well be Worcester Group or Theater of Sources, Theatre Grotowski. Very close use of simple symbols and very, very close focus on archetypes. The work is significant work on rape. It is devoted to the silence, to types of silence that women carry in them, unable to find voice or even find memories that have been repressed of atrocities that happened to them, and also the silencing that society imposes on them, the silence that the society imposes on them. In this performance, Damon tries to speak, is being very aggressively silenced by the chorus of other women who are around her, and then finally she breaks through their voices. She tells a very short outline story, and after a break and some moaning and kind of meditation and crying, women join her with their stories, and these are all stories of incest. A very, very powerful and very important artwork, of course, rooted in CR experiences of the 1970s. We can move to the Blind Beggar Woman, a significant work, which is very dear to my heart, because I'm also very interested in women narratives that are missing from the mainstream culture. In this performance, in Blind Beggar Woman, Betsy Damon references Homer. According to legend, Homer was blind, and she is blindfolded in his performances. But most importantly, he wrote both the Odyssey. If this was one person, we don't know whether it was one Homer or whether it's a composite. But both the Odyssey and Iliad are based on oral traditions. So Damon paid attention to the fact that basically all the historical texts or major epos or religious texts that we have received on many continents from our predecessors going back thousands of years are narrated by men, and they narrate male point of view on culture and on history. So she is a female storyteller here in the streets of New York, begging accidental passers-by for stories. She sits in the pavement and she shouts, "Tell me your story. Everybody has an important story. You have something to share." Of course, the stories were not important. She didn't record them. She didn't remember what people whispered to her ear. It was secret. Sometimes they said something important, sometimes not. But what is important is that there is even more of involvement of a community of almost accidental people whom she didn't know before, but with whom she typed those, not for maybe a brief moment. Importantly, look at the localizations of those locations of those two performances that took place in New York. These are the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, and these are the steps of Federal Hall on Wall Street. It's hard to think about more symbolical seats of patriarchal power than those two. Also significantly, other artists participated in those and collaborated with Betsy Damon on each of these performances. Here you see Marsha Grab, a Chicago-based artist, where they collaborated before in Chicago on 7,000-Year-Old Woman. Here Damon invites her to New York, and Grab works with her archetype of Virgin Mary. Virgin Mary attracts the community much better than the blind beggar woman, but once she acts as medium, you know, through chants and prayers, then people are a little bit more less shy to approach Betsy Damon and engage in conversation. Here on Wall Street, of course, significant percentage of the audience are men, and this is quite incredible. Very rarely in feminist artworks, especially the early ones, we see men that are invited into the project, not excluded. Damon, in all her seeking woman's almost essence, we wanted to say, but who woman is, never disinvited anybody, never pushed anybody outside of her sphere. Here she performs with Lynn Schenfeld, her authentically blind lesbian friend, who is also in the rape performance. So I think partly she inspired the blind beggar woman. They worked on this project together. On the monitor here we have an on-camera recording of 7,000-Year-Old Woman. It's titled Knives and Bags, as it was done in the artist's studio, just for the purpose of documentation. And you can see in this short 8 minutes video that it was an endurance performance that cutting off the oppression symbolized by those bags filled with flour took physical strength, took time. It took about 1 hour. It was heavy, I think around 60 pounds of flour on the artist's body. And then we will see looped here. We have a little bit 2 minutes from Wall Street, incredible footage from this performance. We can move to the next project.
What do you think about Knives? Is a performance Damon started in 1980, and as her other performances, she took it to many places. It's important to realize that her performances were done in the streets of not only New York, but also San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, some other cities, some university campuses. Very often in the streets, most often, especially at the beginning, sometimes also indoors in gallery spaces. This performance serves very well as another example of explanation of what a performance really is. The same exact scenario repeated in very different venues comes as a different work of art. And again, Damon works through workshopping to bringing her co-participants in the project together into public. The performance consists of participants bringing their own knives and then telling stories about those knives and reflecting on the role of knives in their lives, and then they engage in simple activities that they can think of or that they want to do with knives. So in many images we see women chopping meat, for example. Here there is a student of Rhode Island University who cleans the knife with her menstrual blood. Here, an older woman in Washington, D.C., in DuPont Circle, in the middle of the day, one of the roundabouts in Washington, D.C., one of very few projects outdoors which had a kind of umbrella, institutional umbrella. It was sponsored by the Washington Project for the Arts. And the same performance changes in its character entirely when it is taken to Los Angeles Women's Building. This is the same performance at the opening of Galas, the Great American Lesbian Art Show, the first lesbian exhibition on the West Coast. It's important that Damon participated in many first gay shows. First in 1978 in the first lesbian art exhibition in the US, organized by Harmony Hammond at 112th Street. Then here in 1980 in Los Angeles. Then she was also featured in the exhibition titled Extended Sensibilities, which was the first museum gay show organized by Don Cameron in 1982 at the New Museum. So those firsts are really important. So this is what happens with the same performance. What do you think about knives when you have several hundred of California lesbians performing with them? The ritualistic character of it, spiritual but also a real gathering of female power, is overwhelming with this centrally positioned mound of dirt. What is also important is that Damon's intention for this project was to empower women and to make them use knives with more of a sense of security. She noticed simply through these performances that men's and women's relationship to an object which we all use for thousands of years and which serves many basic purposes during the day, that both women and men have very different approaches to it, that women are usually afraid of knives and men are not. So she wanted to change it, but she also wanted to reflect on it.
Shrine for Every Woman, very interesting documentation. These images may not seem as iconic to you, as amazing as the documentation made in New York City streets a couple of years earlier. But Damon often speaks about this performance as maybe her most successful. I also don't know, I think, another serious artist who would do a project with the United Nations that would have that meaning. United Nations organized a conference on women in 1980 in Denmark, Copenhagen, and repeated it 5 years later at Nairobi, Kenya. At both of them, Damon organized Shrine for Every Woman. I think the conference was then repeated, but these are the 2 years when Damon participated in them, in the first two conferences. These two images come from Nairobi, and what she proposed was a common space, a shrine, a sacred space for women to come together and share their experiences. And it really created a safe space where, I will use historical image referring to 1980s, women from both the so-called third world and the Western world could realize that the kind of oppression they suffer and the limitations of their rights are very similar, not different. It was quite crucial. They wrote their dreams and reflections on little pieces of papers and put them in those little bags. They now were free from oppression and could hold some dreams, I guess. This is a booklet, this fantastic 1980s Xerox aesthetics, which I wanted to share in the exhibition. Documents how Betsy Damon narrated her own performance to a New York audience when she came back. And she brought the shrine with her to present it at Soho 20 Galleria and also at the UN Cafe in New York. Importantly, she took with her to participate in this, to work together on this performance, Kathy James, an African-American artist who worked with Betsy in New York. Betsy Damon is seen here. She also talks a lot about limitations that local organizers were trying to put, the organizers of the conference were trying to impose on women. They wanted to use drums and play music together. The organizers didn't want African women to use drums. Drums were reserved for men. But of course, it happened. You can see a bit of a drum here, and it really became this common shared space of liberation and finding each other voices and each other allyship and solidarity. I was speaking at the beginning of Damon's effort of unifying different ideas that we have about women: an artist, a wife, a witch, a lesbian, and so on, and trying to make them come one. And this idea of unity and oneness is also present in the effort of bringing people together over many different divisions. I think something extremely important in today's world as well. Meditation with Stones for the Survival of the Planet, one of the last performances where the porous structure of Betsy Damon's performance art is more and more visible. Here we almost don't see the artist anymore. She's together with, completely meshed into the community with which she enacts the performance. There is no stage anymore. It is completely democratic. And it also plays a function that is not as all performances play. It becomes a meditation for the community, a healing and a moment of reflection on the oppression not only of women but also on the planet, and the need for finding the healing for the planet and focusing on us as part of the planet, subjects which of course have profound meaning today. So a few ephemeral objects, text is always present in Betsy Damon's work. As I said, she always analyzed the meanings of knife, of stone. These are little poems and texts from different cultures speaking about the stones. She uses Beggar now for the stones. And then this documentation covers iterations of this meditation in different locations in New York City. These two images come from it was in the front of Natural History Museum on the pavement, and the next to document a similar meditation in front of a building which we don't think was even a gallery on West Broadway. You see another important feminist artist of the period, Elaine Ailon, here in the center. Betsy Damon is here, both of them, Elaine and Betsy Damon, are also visible in this image shot. Fantastic image shot from the window above. None of these were institutionalized. This is really pure guerrilla in the streets of New York, and Damon would repeat it on a new moon. She would organize it on a new year. It was something that was almost like had a rhythmical ritual character. Her last performance in 1986, Listen, Respect, Revere, was performed only once in New York City in another theater alternative venue named the Brecht Forum. In it, what makes it very unusual is that its bone is text that Damon wrote herself, very beautiful text, a kind of a poem written in prose, where she discusses traditional gender roles and the insistence that we as society put on bringing up boys as boys and girls as girls. Boys being formed for to be able to be cruel, to participate in the wars, women and women to be submissive. The text references other cultures as well. The whole is presented here. Two original dancers who danced with those wings. In 1986, one March, Helen Child was able to meet us here, join us for the performance 2 weeks ago, and Damon re-performed it with young people in at the La Mama Galleria, and the whole text of the performance is presented in this vitrine for our audience. Thank you.